I want to devote this lecture to resistance among the non-whites and especially among the black South Africans in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. This is a very large and expansive topic. A lot of important individuals, large personalities about whom we could say a great deal. This is more of a bare bones kind of chronological outline. I will devote a little time to key figures, including Steve Biko, whose writings are assigned for this class. We'll also talk about Nelson Mandela and his early political career and some other things here. So the African National Congress had been founded in 1912, and for the first few decades of its existence, the leadership of the ANC had been in the hands of educated elites who I think it's accurate to say we're not always in tune with the common experience of the black South African. Many of them have been educated at foreign universities. I think although they tried to comprehend this, they were very much a political organization along the lines of Western political parties. But as we've seen, their efforts to gain any sort of recognition as representative political bodies failed because the whites were in no mood to allow for any sort of representation. And so the ANC ended up being a pretty ineffectual body for several decades. However, in the 1940s, after the end of World War II, there were a number of young political activists. By young, we mean people in their 20s and 30s, who came to prominence on the basis of their strong and charismatic personalities, their rhetorical abilities, their organizational acumen, and other things. They formed something called the Youth League of the ANC, and I think we talked about this earlier. But in 1949, I believe, 48 or 49, a few members of the ANC Youth League were elected to the general ANC executive. Among these were the individuals pictured here, Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu. Both of these pictures, I will say, come after their were taken after their incarceration in Robben Island. And the other one that I'll mention here is Oliver Tambo. Now, both Mandela and Tambo were educated at Fort Hare. Both were expelled from the school for their political activities, I believe. But they completed law degrees through correspondence courses and opened up a law practice in Johannesburg. And they joined the ANC Youth League. They were elected to the executive body. Walter Sisulu was not a Fort Hare product, but ended up being a close interlocutor with them, and ended up being probably Mandela's closest associate for many decades in Robben Island after they were both imprisoned there. And so this new leadership group ended up transforming the ANC into a much more politically active body. Following the example of Mohandas Gandhi, they began to call for and organize campaigns of passive resistance. That is, people, actively defying the unjust laws, refusing to show their passes according to the pass laws, refusing to abide by the terms of segregation, right? Much as was seen in the 1950s and early 60s in the southern United States, the defiance of the Jim Crow laws. Well, the ANC began to be involved in this, right? There was a campaign in 1952-53 where thousands of people across the country defied the discriminatory laws. Thousands of them ended up being arrested, and some of this ended up, even though the ANC had called for this to be entirely nonviolent, Riots broke out. There was some looting, and the government cracked down on this, and it was eventually called off. But the ANC did not cease its activities at that point. It began to reach out to other political groups. The South African Indian Congress, in particular, had gone through a similar kind of transformation with a new, younger group of leadership coming to the fore. And so the two groups, along with other bodies that represented non-white interests, came together in a conference in 1955 and adopted this document called the Freedom Charter. Now, the Freedom Charter is a tremendously important piece of literature, for the history of South Africa. It's one that requires some discussion. Looking at it closely, I've assigned it as part of your readings in the Williams book. It's Part 4, Section B, Document 8, starting on page 282. And I don't want to take the time here, because this could become a very long and unwieldy video, to go through a lot of this. But suffice it to say that there were, although this document calls largely for democratic measures to be put into place in South Africa, right? The one person, one vote thing, the recognition of equal rights for all people and all of that, it did adopt some socialist positions. And as a result, the National Party government was able to label this as a communist document and to continue their smear campaign to label the ANC and other organizations as communist organizations. There's one clause, for instance, right? One section, I should say. It's the on page 283 of the Williams book. I'm about 2/3 of the way down the page, where, sorry for the yawn, the people shall share in the country's wealth, it says, right? The national wealth of our country, the heritage of all South Africans, shall be restored to the people. The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. All other industry and trade shall be controlled to assist the well-being of the people. All people shall have equal rights to trade where they choose, to manufacture, and to enter all trades, crafts, and professions. That last one, not so much, but the first three clauses under the people shall share the country's wealth did have similarities to, to the writings of Marx, to some of the writings of Lenin. This smacks of the revolution of the proletariat and all of that. So, but this cannot, I think, in any real way be called a communist document, because the vast majority of it calls simply for true democracy to be put into place, right? And for human rights to be acknowledged, and everything. But those clauses did again allow for some criticism. Now this organization, this sort of collaboration with other organizations, and the adoption of the Freedom Charter lent new life to the ANC. They continued to organize various campaigns of passive resistance in the 1950s. To the extent that, and these, were met with increasingly oppressive measures by the white government, who did not allow for such things. We can track the activities of the ANC against many of the laws that we talked about in an earlier lecture that were put into place. The Sabotage Act and the Anti-Communist Act and all of these other things, right? And see that the government was responding to the activities of the ANC repeatedly by issuing new laws to make to limit their ability to organize Africans, and they eventually just declare the ANC to be an illegal organization, right? But these passive resistance measures were not approved of by everyone, or they were seen as ineffectual by many, and so some individuals began to turn against the leadership of the ANC, or to at least go in other directions. The most significant politician who broke with the ANC was Robert Sobukwe, another Fort Hare product. He was a professor of Bantu language instruction at the University of Witwatersrand, so one of the foremost black academics in the country. But he was influenced by the growing sentiment of Pan-Africanism, and an early form of what comes to be called by Steve Biko and others black consciousness. Okay. Now that this would require some prelude to talk about in any real fashion, but suffice it to say that Pan-African sentiment was the thought that all Africans should unite together, and only by uniting would they be able to throw off the yoke of the colonial oppressor and gain their true independence on their own terms rather than the terms of the Europeans. There were many key proponents of Pan-Africanism, including many of the leaders of the newly independent African nations like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Julius Nyerere, another Fort Hare product, by the way, in Tanzania. Sobukwe embraced this Pan-African notion and formed in 1960 the Pan-African Congress. Okay. Actually, it was 1959, I suppose, that this was formed. 1960 is a really pivotal year. Now, the PAC was open to non-passive means to violence if necessary, but initially they were involved in mostly nonviolent resistance as well. They organized protests. And it was a PAC organized protest in 1960 in Sharpeville. Sharpeville is a township just outside of the city of Vereeniging, and that's in what's called the Fall Triangle, just south of Johannesburg. But this group of protesters, several hundred of them, showed up outside of a police station. Many of them tore up or burned their passes. They were inviting arrest. This was an important sort of strategy. It was not unique, of course, to South Africa. Dr. King and others in the southern United States were doing the same thing, like trying to clog up the machinery of justice by inviting mass arrest and all of that, right? To make themselves such a nuisance that they would bring about change as a result, right? So that was the goal in Sharpeville on March 21st, 1960. The police on that occasion fired some shots into the crowd. The crowd erupted, obviously began to flee in all directions, and the police ended up opening fire and killing more than 60 protesters and wounding close to 200. The picture at the bottom here is of the field outside the police station after this whole thing was over. This became known as the Sharpeville massacre. And it was the first time, really, that the consequences of apartheid became, the violent consequences of apartheid became international news. Okay. This hit the front pages of newspapers all across the world. A good deal of criticism was leveled at the South African government as a result of this, and we'll talk some about that in a little bit here. And this led to more protests across the country. However, the government was in no way contrite about this and used whatever means they could come up with to quell this resistance and to reassume their control over the country. A few months after Sharpeville, actually, it was only a few days after Sharpeville, about a week and a half later, there was a massive march in Cape Town. Tens of thousands of protesters showed up, and they were marching to the Parliament building in Cape Town. The police confronted them, and they were the protesters were told that the government officials would be glad to talk with the organizers of the protest and sit down and have a meaningful conversation if the people would disperse. And so, they staged their peaceful protests. They went home. The leaders of the protest, including a university student named Philip Hosanna, he was the main organizer of this, went to meet with government officials that evening and was promptly arrested and imprisoned. And these protests ended up sort of dying out. Okay. 1960 was 60-61 were in fact key years in the whole history of the anti-apartheid struggle. This was the year, for instance, when after the Sharpeville massacre, the ANC decided to change its tactics, and the Pan-African Congress became even more radical in its proposed solutions to ending apartheid. When even white liberal groups began to embrace potentially violent means to strike out against the apartheid government. The ANC formed an internal organization devoted to performing acts of sabotage and violence. We might properly, I think, label this terrorism, though, not necessarily in a pejorative fashion. This group was called Nkonto Wesizwe. That means in Xhosa, the spear of the nation. The Pan-African Congress formed a similar organization known as Poko, which means pure in either Zulu or Xhosa, or maybe both. There was also a multiracial movement called the African Resistance Movement, made up mostly of white university students, which began to perform acts of sabotage and terrorism. And this gave so they carried out some of these acts, mostly sabotage against factories or refineries or other things. These are not civilian targets necessarily, but things that would hurt the South African economy or would send a message to the South African government. And this gave the National Party government the excuse to begin to use increased violence themselves. Not that they hadn't already. I mean, the Sharpeville massacre is a pretty obvious one, right? But it also gave them an excuse to trace these back to the leaders of the ANC and to carry out mass arrests and to decree these organizations, both the ANC and the PAC, as illegal. So both of them became illegal organizations, no longer allowed any ability to meet or carry out any activities legally under the South African government. The leadership was arrested over the next few years, especially during a July 1963 raid on a farmhouse in Rivonia, which is a suburb of Johannesburg. The newspaper headline at the bottom of the slide here is showing that. And 17 leaders of the ANC were found in the farmhouse and arrested and put on trial. Nelson Mandela and others were also arrested, not in Rivonia, but over the course of the early 1960s, defended themselves in court and were sentenced, most of them, to be executed. Those sentences were then commuted to life in prison with hard labor, and they were shipped off to this prison on Robben Island. Robben Island is a few miles out into the ocean, off of the coast of Cape Town, and Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and many others ended up spending the next 20 plus years of their lives there. Mandela was there for around 20 years before he was moved. He was imprisoned for a total of about 27 years. Sisulu was there for a similar amount of time. The one who did escape this net was Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela's law partner, a fellow member of the ANC Youth League and the ANC Executive Council. He escaped the net, actually was able to get out of the country, and he took up residence in Lusaka, Zambia, which had been newly decreed independent by the British government. And for the next 27 years, Oliver Tambo would function as the president of the African National Congress, though he did it from Zambia. And Mandela tends to get a lot of the press and a lot of the credit, but Tambo has a fascinating story in and of himself, as does Sisulu, as do other ANC figures like Joe Slovo and Chris Hani. And actually, Chris Hani was also the leader of the South African Communist Party. All of their stories deserve to be told, and if you have an interest in this, I would encourage you to look them up and check out their biographies. Right. So Tambo assumed leadership of the ANC in exile, and the ANC, for the most part, was almost entirely was defunct inside of South Africa itself. It was not able to operate except in the shadows, but it continued to command the attention, the imagination of non-white South Africans, and Mandela in particular was held up as a symbol of courage, and continued to be someone who was on the minds of people all through the intervening decades while he was in prison. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, in the absence of any legal political party to represent them, Black resistance began to take other forms. There was a good deal of protest through the medium of arts and literature. There were Black theater companies who put on productions that had an overt or implicit, at least implicit, anti-apartheid message. There were publications like Drum Magazine, which which were subtle about it, but which represented the Black position in politics. Some publications were banned by the government, but arts and literature remained a medium for people to protest and to resist. Another one, and this is not one that was mentioned a great deal in the literature for this course, but let me mention it here, were the Zionist churches. We talked about the formation of these in the 1920s. Zionist churches came to be among the largest religious bodies in South Africa. Thousands, millions even, of South Africans joined these Zionist churches, who preached a message of African deliverance, of Africans as the Black Africans as the chosen people. There was a lot of charismatic activity in these churches, a lot of dancing. Their forms of dancing doubled as forms of protest, right? Their uniforms were symbolically designed to demonstrate, Black solidarity and this idea of Black chosenness. The Zion Christian Church, for instance, was among the largest denominations in South Africa, and the members of the Zion Christian Church proudly wore these badges everywhere they went. Actually, the ZCC, as it's called, ended up splitting into two kind of branches. And when I lived in South Africa, I saw these all over the place. There was a badge with a green felt horizontal rectangle with a black circle at the top of the rectangle, and then a pin, either a star or there was I think a dove was the other one. But people would wear these everywhere to express their solidarity with other Black Africans. Even though non-whites were not allowed under law to organize labor unions, they did this in secret. And these unions organized effective strikes in the late 1960s and early 1970s that actually did produce some results. The wage gap, while it never got much closer, did begin to close a little bit, to the point that Blacks working in the manufacturing and mining sectors only, earned maybe 4 or 5 times less than white workers did, rather than 10 times less than white workers did. But these labor unions, even non-official labor unions, were pretty effective at resisting. Another major quarter of resistance came from the education sector. And this is where I bring up Steve Biko. Now, I will devote the live session largely to talking about Biko, to looking at the writings in the I Write What I Like collection that you're assigned for this course. But let me mention just 2 points that Biko makes. Okay, so Biko, first of all, as a 22-year-old, became a leading member of the National Union of South African Students until he decided that that organization did not have a real stake in resistance against apartheid, because it was led almost entirely by whites. And so there's a big part of Biko's writings that are devoted to criticism of what he calls white liberals and or white progressives. And this is similar to the criticism that Martin Luther King levels against white liberals in the letter from Birmingham jail, for instance, right? Biko and King often use similar kind of rhetoric. I frankly do not know how much the writings of King may have influenced Biko. That's something I've never kind of researched. But I mean, Biko was incredibly well read. I would be very surprised if he hadn't been exposed to King directly and probably read a lot of him. He doesn't mention him necessarily. Instead, Biko went on to form his own organization, which was called the South African Students Organization, which was an organization of non-white students, and especially black students, right? And this is where he gets into the pillar of his thought, kind of the central pillar of his thought, which is black consciousness. And you're going to need to read this carefully. He's not a difficult read. He wrote a lot of essays under a pen name which was Frank Talk, right? And he really is very frank, very straightforward in what he's saying. There's little subtlety to Biko, though he is also a skilled wordsmith. In the I Write What I Like book, there's an essay called We Blacks, and this, I think, captures a lot of what Biko means by black consciousness. Basically, he says blacks have to understand their own heritage and their own identity rather than being told what it means to be black by whites. Because even if whites claim to be anti-apartheid, even if they claim to be our friends, claim to be fighting for our cause, ultimately they are beneficiaries of this system, even if they disagree with it, and they are never going to be able to represent our interests like we can represent them. So we cannot stand in the shadows of the white leadership, even those who claim to be our friends. We've got to come up with our own consciousness. Now, Biko's this is not original to him. A lot of this is found in Pan-African thinking, and even goes back to some figures in literature in the early 20th century, like Aimé Césaire or Marcus Garvey. Some of them from Africa, some of them from the Caribbean or other places. But Biko has absorbed all of that and is one of the most skilled crafters of black consciousness thought. So on page 29 in the I Write What I Like collection, in the We Blacks essay, Biko writes, one writer makes the point that in an effort to destroy completely the structures that had been built up in the African society and to impose their imperialism with an unnerving totality, the colonialists were not satisfied merely with holding a people in their grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. They turned to the past of the oppressed people and distorted, disfigured, and destroyed it. No longer was reference made to African culture. It became barbarism. Africa was the dark continent. Religious practices and customs were referred to as superstition. The history of African society was reduced to tribal battles and internecine wars. There was no conscious migration by the people from one place of abode to another. No, it was always flight from one tyrant who wanted to defeat the tribe, not for any positive reason. Think here, by the way, parenthetically, about Shaka Zulu and some of the manipulation of the image of Shaka, right? So that coheres with what Biko's saying here. But merely to wipe them out of the face of this earth. No wonder, and here's one of the key points that he's making, No wonder the African child learns to hate his heritage in his days at school. So negative is the image presented to him that he tends to find solace only in close identification with the white society. Biko says we've got to change all of that, right? So he continues in the next paragraph. No doubt, therefore, part of the approach envisaged in bringing about black consciousness has to be directed to the past, to seek to rewrite the history of the black man and to produce it in the heroes who form the core of the African background. Right? So we need to find our own history and to tell about it on our terms, to find our own heroes, and this will help us form our own identity that is not dependent on the European version of what Africa is, right? Only when we have this identity will we be able to throw off the yoke of the oppressor and to represent ourselves, not to wait for others, that is white progressives, white anti-apartheid individuals, to represent us for us, right? We've got to do it ourselves. Biko himself was an excellent example of this. Again, if you're trying to choose a film to write the film review on, I highly, highly recommend the film Cry Freedom, which is about Biko. Denzel Washington plays Biko. Highly recommend that one, even though a lot of it is told from the perspective of one of his white interlocutors. There still is, I think, Washington does an excellent job portraying Biko and the strong personality that he was. The education sector was the location of one of the key transition points or transitional events in South African history, and especially in the period of apartheid. This was the Soweto uprising in 1976. And since this video is running quite long, I would draw your attention to document 9 in the Clark and Werger book. This was assigned for this week. This is the testimony of Dan Monsisi. And then the following document, by the way, talks about him being tortured in prison. Mentioned, police brutality and things like that in the last lecture or previous lecture. But Monsisi was a student organizer of the Soweto protests, and he talks about why they did this. Simply, this was a black student objection to a new law, a new educational decree that mandated that half of all instruction in schools, in African schools, be in Afrikaans, and specifically classes in mathematics and social studies were to be taught in Afrikaans. Now, why is that a problem? Well, first of all, Afrikaans is the language of the oppressor. Blacks felt that way. They despised the language, wanted nothing to do with it. But moreover, practically speaking, Afrikaans is not something, mathematics is not a language or not a subject that you can, teach effectively just as effectively in every language as every other, right? There is a specific terminology that has to be mastered. And so students were learning these very technical Afrikaans words rather than the English words, which would allow them some hope of social advancement, much better opportunities. English was just practically speaking a much better language to learn things in. And so students gathered initially at one high school in Soweto, Orlando West High School, and staged a protest. This this spread all across Soweto, and the police, trying to quell the protest, ended up sicking their dogs on the students. The students responded by killing the dogs rather than being bitten by them, and the police at that point began to open fire. And a couple of young students, including, and this is one of the most famous images from the whole of the 20th century, right? If you were to capture the South African experience in a single photo, this one does very well. I think this has been voted to various lists of the most influential photographs of the 20th century. This is a picture of one of the young students. His name is Hector Peterson, having been shot by the police, being carried The one, the girl to the left, I believe, is Hector Peterson's sister. I can't remember the names of the two students here, the other two students, but the one is the sister. But they were, and this was sort of scarred into the minds of people all over the world as what was happening in South Africa. And really, from the Soweto uprising on, the South African government was never able to get a handle on the country like it had in the 1960s. There was constant violence, constant protests, constant riot, and this just became the norm in South Africa from this point on. 176 students were killed in the Soweto uprising. The protests spread across the country. The final death, that's the official count, by the way. There may have been several hundred more unofficially killed in this initial uprising. But these protests spread across the country, and several hundred more were killed as part of the protests. Images like the image of Hector Peterson went international and led to new rounds of condemnation by the United Nations. And this also led many countries to become more interested in helping to sponsor the anti-apartheid struggle. The Black Resistance was a beneficiary of foreign sponsorship, and there was some from the newly independent governments, like the government of Zambia, who gave quarter to, or rather sanctuary to Oliver Tambo and the other leaders of the ANC in exile, to the government of Angola, who allowed the ANC to form have training compounds where they trained people in the art of sabotage, right? And the same thing happened in Mozambique and other places. So many of these countries that surrounded South Africa, were sponsors of the ANC and expressed a great deal of solidarity with them. And there were, of course, people who spoke out against apartheid all across the world. The UN General Assembly passed an annual condemnation from 1952 to the 1980s. Yearly would pass a condemnation or issue a general resolution from the UN General Assembly condemning apartheid. The South African government, for the most part, paid no attention to this. But this did help the resistance. It helped them to stay together, to stay motivated. So these foreign sponsors were invaluable. There's a lot more to Black resistance than this, as I said, but this video has already gone on long enough, so I think we will end it there. Thanks.